Very few C-segment SUVs have drummed up quite the same level of anticipation as the Jaecoo J7. Billed as a premium off-road SUV, one of very few in the segment that can, and after having proven its mettle at M4 Trek, we finally have the J7 out for a full review to tell you what it's truly like to live with when you're not trying to wade through water or battle through some mud. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our full review of the 2024 Jaecoo J7. Now, the Jaecoo J7 does propose a very unique exterior design, at least one that we haven't seen in the mass market space for quite some time. That's because Jaecoo believes that their cars should appear more like traditional SUVs rather than the hybrid crossovers that you get all the time, which is why up front you get this massive waterfall grille that just goes straight down. This car is essentially made up of boxes, which is why it looks as distinctive as it does. Now, up here you'll find the daytime running lights in this sort of checkered pattern, which also double up as the indicators. The headlights and high beams actually live down here, and these are all full LED units regardless of whether or not you take the two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive model. Now, you do have a set of LED fog lights way down there, but they are very small and rather obscure, and I suppose they're not really part of a design feature. But if you ask me, I do think the J7 does look very distinctive indeed from any angle, but this front end is very assertive indeed. It's the same story down the side because, again, you can really see the bluffness of the front and the bluffness of the rear. They're all just straight lines. And in fact, when you look down the side, there are also only really straight lines. Aside from the wheel arch sort of flares, everything here is straight. And as a result, it creates this very traditional look, which I think looks really good against the crossovers that you get a lot of the time nowadays. Now, because this is a modern car, naturally we do get oversized alloy wheels, or they're more or less what you'd expect nowadays. So these are 19-inch alloy wheels wrapped in GT Comfort tires, which are all right, very middle of the road in terms of their overall performance. And you also get flush door handles in order to improve aerodynamics, although the point of that seems to be unclear because those wing mirrors aren't doing this car any favor. They are at least very large, so you can get a good view out. Now, down the side, the design features are relatively minimal because, again, that's not really what SUVs are about, or at least according to Jaecoo, which is why the design features are minimized to sort of this D-pillar garnish here, and again, those diamond-cut alloy wheels, because that's not the point. Now, the back end of the J7 is just as distinctive in the front, where you get that same sort of checkered pattern for the brake lights and indicators, whereas you still have a full-width LED light bar that goes all the way across, and the Jaecoo badge lives within this sort of Perspex housing, which looks very upmarket indeed. Now, Jaecoo is actually a brand that's a joint venture between Chery and Land Rover, which is why you will see some very Land Rover-esque design elements. For example, the rear wiper is hidden up here in this spoiler, and of course you do get those pop-out door handles I mentioned earlier. You do get a couple of exhaust exits at the rear, although they're not real, but at least they look good, and it will take some time before you notice that they're fake. Now, behind this standard fit powered tailgate, you will find a pretty good amount of space. This is sort of on par for the course with other C-segment SUVs, and it's broadly the same size as what you would have seen from the Proton X70 as well as the Chery Tiggo 7 Pro. However, one benefit that this car has is underneath this boot floor, you will find a full-size spare wheel, which means that should the worst befall you, you can actually sort things out on your own. There are also storage spaces back here, which I think is very practical, a couple of hooks, although the 12-volt socket is sort of hidden up here, which means it's a little bit more difficult in order to sort of pull a cable to run a vacuum cleaner, for example, but it is entirely possible. On top of that, you can fold the rear seats 60/40, and you also have these tie-down hooks here should you need to tie something down. Now, the interior of the Jaecoo J7 certainly puts the premium foot forward because the material quality in here is excellent. Everything from the dash top to the dash front, to the tops of the doors, even this lovely textured material here and down here, everything is stitched and soft. So it looks good and it feels good too. On top of that, the interior architecture also lends itself a little bit of that Jaguar Land Rover sort of relationship, because you have these two very large, very crisp digital screens to control the car's functions, where you have this screen to control the majority of your functions and this display here to show you what you need while you're driving. And overall, everything just responds really well. It's nice and snappy, and as far as I'm concerned, it does work quite well. The only problem I have is, like with many modern cars, the HVAC controls are built into the screen. Now, when you're using the screen, normally it lives on a little ribbon at the bottom of the screen itself, but when you're in Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, it disappears, which means you need to swipe to get anything done. Aside from that though, I do think that this system does need a little bit more work, especially for international markets like ours, because the English in here is quite shocking. And the same can be said of this display, where things like, for example, your trip from start and your trip from reset is set as after the start and after the reset. Well, at least if you don't want to stare at that, you actually get a color heads-up display for this car, which shows you things like your Bluetooth music, your navigation, if you use the built-in navigation, as well as the ADAS functionality. It also has a really irritating voice command system, because even though I didn't say the activation word, it's now on. Now that aside, this car at least comes with dual zone climate control with heated and ventilated front seats, which are also both powered. This front seat also comes with the boss switch that people here seem to like so much, so you can manipulate this seat from the buttons via the side of the seat itself, whereas the controls for the driver's seat are naturally down here. You also get memory functionality, but it only appears to be a single stage memory, and there are no buttons for it. Everything lives in the screen, for better or worse. You get an electrochromatic rearview mirror here, as well as that full panoramic sunroof, which you can open the front portion of with an electric sunblind. I can't believe I have to mention electric sunblinds, but we appear to be there now. We have some space underneath the center console. Unfortunately, the USB ports live on the left side, with the 12-volt socket living on the right. You get a couple of large-size cup holders, big enough for a big bottle like this, with a phone holder set in the middle, which I think is very useful. There's also something that appears to be a tissue box holder, where you can have tissues come out of here, which I think is quite nice. If you open this center console lid, you will find a very shallow tray lined in felt, so if you wanted to put keys on it or whatever, you could do that. But underneath that, you will find a good amount of space in here, and this is air conditioned, which means that you can keep drinks cool on a long drive, for example, and it still will remain quite comfortable. Now that aside, you also get this funky gear selector and an unusually large drive mode selector wheel here, where other functions like the hazard lights, as well as the switch to manipulate this, the air conditioning, and the front defogger live here. Now, Jaecoo is very keen to point out there's also a 50 kilowatt fast charger, wireless fast charger here, with a little vent as well. So if you have a phone that's capable of charging that fast, you can plug it in and keep it cool without too much issue. And in terms of other entertainment items, you get a 64 color ambient lighting system in here, which I think is quite good for a car of this price. And you also get a Sony audio system, which is quite punchy. Now, in terms of ergonomics, you can get this seat to a relatively comfortable position, and you do have a lot of adjustment in the steering wheel, which means that you should be able to find a decently comfortable driving position. One thing I will note is that the right side wing mirror doesn't appear to move out far enough, because I'd like to minimize my blind spot, whereas this car is insistent that you see the full length of the car in the bottom left corner. Oh well. Now, in the back of the J7, as you can see, I have a good amount of knee room. With the front seats at my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite that panoramic sunroof. I will note that these seats appear to be mounted quite low, which means, as you can see now, I don't have that much in terms of under-thigh support. But because the front seats are mounted a little bit higher, it does mean that I can stretch out under the seat in front of me and then make full use of that under-thigh support. However, that low mounting point also means that the belt line in this car does seem quite high, so a view out is relatively restricted, and this will be particularly noteworthy for parents with children, especially in child seats, because the ability to look out may save them from some degree of car sickness. You also get only a singular air conditioning vent back here, which I think is quite annoying, because you'd want one pointed to each of the outer passengers usually, but at least you still get a USB-C and USB-A port. Now, ISOFIX mounts in here are very easy to locate, and they do have plastic covers which are sort of mounted on the seat itself, which means you'll never lose them. The rear doors open a decent size in order to fit a bulky rear-facing child seat, but unfortunately there doesn't appear to be an ISOFIX mount on the front seat, which means that child seats need to be put in the rear. Quality, however, is just as good as it is in the front, with lots of soft touch materials in all the places that I mentioned earlier. You get these nice chunky grab handles, and I think that overall interior build quality is quite good. For practicality, you have 3 pockets behind the front seats, and you also get a relatively large door bin here, big enough for a litre sized bottle, or in fact other stuff that you might have lying around. You get the deployable center armrest with cup holders, and like I said, it's just pleasant. And that air of pleasantness extends into the way this car drives. Now, I apologize for the change of attire and so on, because the original plan was to actually continue from the earlier sentence you would have seen to then get straight into the driving impressions, but I decided to actually delay talking about the driving impressions because I wanted to evaluate this car a little bit more. You see, the reason for this is because Jaecoo is Chery's upmarket brand, and so to them, they compete with brands like Peugeot and Volkswagen, which means that, and to some extent also Mazda, which is why to them they believe that these cars are refined enough and well engineered enough to go up against the very best within that segment in what motoring journalists like to refer to as sort of the premium mass sort of space. Not quite your Mercedes-Benz and BMW, I apologize for the little logo here, but just half a step lower. So what that means is this has to be markedly better than something like a Tiggo 7 Pro, and then put it on par with things like the Volkswagen Tiguan, or Tiguan Allspace as it is now, and the Mazda CX-5. And this is a particularly rarefied space, you see, because there's a reason why there is only sort of Peugeot, Volkswagen, and Mazda within this space. And all of these companies have a certain attention to detail that marks their cars out as being built to a slightly higher standard. So for Mazdas, for example, there is an incredible attention to detail. For Volkswagen, they do have an incredible set of powertrains available with their vehicles. And with Peugeot, it is an exceptional choice of materials and an eye for build quality, believe it or not. So does the Jaecoo stack up, particularly against, for the J7 at least, vehicles like the Peugeot 3008, the Volkswagen Tiguan, and the Mazda CX-5? Well, under the bonnet, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a 1.6-litre turbocharged engine paired to a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox with power either going to the front wheels or all 4. Now, that is ultimately Jaecoo's strength. They believe that they are an off-road SUV brand, which means that all models will be made available with all-wheel drive, at least the choice of, should you want it. Now, compared to the CX-5, it is now very limited in order to get an all-wheel drive. You have to get a 2.5 turbo to get all-wheel drive. With Volkswagen, you have to get a Tiguan Allspace R line in order to enjoy all-wheel drive. And in Peugeot, they just don't give you all-wheel drive at all. So that is certainly one benefit. And in terms of comparison, how these powertrains stack up, I do think that the J7 does have a decently polished powertrain in the sense that power comes on very smoothly and the gearbox does a very good job at sort of mushing gears together in such a way that it is barely imperceptible. Now, the Proton X70's 7-speed double-clutch gearbox also does a very good job at blending the gears together to the point where it's very hard to tell where the shift points are exactly, and so this is certainly a good thing. Now, beyond that, there are certain other aspects as well. So, for example, with the Volkswagen, you have a very typically Germanic sort of drive where it's very confident, but not exactly floaty. And to that end, I think the Jaecoo is kind of sort of on par. This J7 is very impressively refined in terms of sort of how it's put together. And in terms of the ride, in terms of primary ride, for example, it does take out the very worst of the lumps and bumps, especially on the motorway. And in terms of secondary ride, I do think this car settles down quickly enough that it never feels unsettling. If you were to compare this, for example, to the Chery Tiggo 8 Pro, which is one segment higher but broadly similar in price, that car has a much softer, much floatier suspension, which again doesn't exactly provide a degree of confidence. And when you put those two together, you end up with a car that is decently confident. Not the most confident thing in the world, but is decently confident. And so for most people, as they drive about, going about their day, they will be quite happy with the way the Jaecoo J7 handles itself. Now, the next point to talk about is obviously refinement. So, for example, the Mazda CX-5 has recently been updated to include things like laminated acoustic glass all the way around in order to reduce the amount of wind noise, and a degree of work has gone to reduce the amount of road roar as well. Now, to that end, I think the J7 does at least benefit from very impressively low levels of wind noise intrusion. I say this because this car also benefits from laminated glass all the way around, and so wind whistle and stuff like that is impressively low in a car like this. Again, this car, for what it's priced at, is not exactly the most expensive thing in the world, and I'd like to think that this is about on par with entry-level premium SUVs, and so again, that's very impressive for this new brand. The only trouble I have is in terms of road raw. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car runs on GT Comfort tires, and although comfort is in their name, I have no doubt that they do some work in terms of reducing the amount of vibration into the cabin, etc. The only trouble is road raw is a little bit high. I think that another layer of sound insulation, for example, around the wheel arches would have gone a good distance in order to minimize this. But unfortunately, unless you're on very, very nicely smooth or recently retarred surfaces, this road, for example, I know is on the slightly coarser side of things, and so it is a little bit louder than usual. But for the most part, it's not as quiet as you would like, particularly again for something that's billing itself as premium. Now, in terms of driving dynamics, this is another very important part because Mazdas, for example, provide excellent driving dynamics without compromising comfort. Well, the Jaecoo J7, I suspect, is very much a product of that relationship between Chery and Land Rover, because this car drives something like a Land Rover. So as I mentioned earlier, this car is confident but not floaty. However, it does err on the side of floaty, which means that it does try to give you a more comfortable ride above anything else. And so it does remind me very much of driving a Land Rover. Land Rover products are very unashamed in their pursuit of comfort and refinement above all else. If you want dynamics, buy a Jaguar. And so for the Jaecoo, it does feel that this is clearly not designed to be an engaging driver's car. Now, does that upset or disappoint people like me? Sure, because I enjoy driving cars. I spend a lot of time driving them, and I enjoy cars that give me some degree of engagement. However, I also know that it is ludicrous to expect a C-segment SUV to be as tidy and engaging as a sports car or a hot hatchback. And so, contextually, this car is still quite impressive. It's just, it would have been nice if the suspension was slightly more sophisticated, given the fact that you've got double wishbones in the front and a multi-link rear suspension at the back, which is normally where you find rear suspension. You would think that this car has the bones, at least, of a very tidy handling car, but evidently not. Now, the last couple of points I want to touch on is fuel economy and safety. So, as I mentioned, this car runs a 1.6-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder, which is very closely related to the powertrain that we get in the Chery Tiggo 7 Pro. Now, in that car, we remarked that the average fuel economy was somewhere between 8.2 to 8.5 litres per 100 kilometers, depending on traffic conditions and so on and so forth, as it usually is with most cars. But what's weird is that this J7 is doing marginally better fuel economy. So it is not unreasonable, or it hasn't at least been unsurprising for me to get into this car for a drive and arrive at my destination with the car reporting about 7.1 to 7.8 litres per 100 kilometers. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that I drive in normal mode, not eco or sport, which means I believe that this is most representative of what the car will do with a reasonable driver. Now, of course, the faster you drive, the more miles you do on the motorway, the better that this would go. And of course, you spend more time in traffic jams, naturally your fuel consumption will go up. So the figure that I'm giving you is not exactly gospel, but it does seem that Jaecoo's engineers have done something to refine the overall package being presented with this car, because in addition to it shifting and overall responding better than what we saw in the Tiggo 7 Pro, it is clearly also a little bit more economical. Now, I will also preface this by saying that we are driving the two-wheel drive model, not the all-wheel drive model. And so naturally, with an all-wheel drive car, it will consume a little bit more, but I suspect that the Jaecoo J7 two-wheel drive will be the car that most people buy. And so this is very good. In fact, since I started driving 12 minutes ago, it's now saying 6.9 litres per 100 kilometers. It's a very impressive car. Now, the last point I want to touch on is safety, because at the end of the day, A C-segment SUV is largely going to be purchased by people with families. And so family buyers will put a high priority on safety, especially things like active safety. You want a car that's able to intervene and assist should something go wrong, and I do think the J7 is decently specified for the purpose. So Jaecoo claims that the J7 comes with their level 2.5 semi-autonomy, as we've seen before from the brand. And so that includes things like autonomous emergency braking, traffic jam assist, radar-guided cruise control, lane keep, lane centering, blind spot monitoring, etc., the usual gamut of things, with the addition of things like the 540-degree camera, which basically means 360 plus something underneath, which just uses the existing 4 set of cameras, as well as things like lane intervention control. Now, things like these do make, or rather it means that this car is comprehensively equipped on paper, but in reality, the differences are, it's worth pointing out. So for starters, this car's adaptive cruise control is not exactly the most smooth operator in the world, and it's not that it's good on the motorway and bad in traffic jams or vice versa. Instead, the way it works is when the road is open, it sort of slightly hesitates to accelerate rather than smoothly get you up to your preset speed. Instead, it sort of hunts a little with the accelerator and not the gearbox. And then when you're stuck in traffic, this becomes another issue. So I like to set the distance to be as close as possible because Malaysians love to cut queue, even when you can clearly see that the vehicle behind is trailing. And so even with the closest distance, it's still a decent way away. But that's not the problem. The problem is that at the closest distance, the way it brakes is so sudden that it makes progress in this car very juddery and it's very uncomfortable, which means that you end up setting it to distance 2, in which case, for example, when you're on the motorway, it gets a little bit better. When you're in traffic, it also gets a little bit better. But intervention, should there be a vehicle that suddenly cuts in your queue with a very large distance or difference in terms of speed, like the vehicle in front is going significantly slower than you are, then at that point, again, the intervention is a little bit too harsh. I think that the R&D engineers at Chery, and by extension Jaecoo, need to do a little bit more work in order to refine these ADAS features and functions, because they need to be trustworthy enough that consumers can use them on a regular basis. I have found that in my time with the J7, I haven't really been able to rely on it as much as I would like. And bear in mind, when you compare this again to Volkswagen's IQ Drive, which is incredibly polished, as well as Mazda's suite of active safety systems, it's particularly noteworthy that this car doesn't quite cut the mustard in terms of how you would want your ADAS functionality to work. It's acceptable in a Chery because it's more affordable. In a Jaecoo, not so much, because again, this is going to be pushing 160,000 ringgit, which means ultimately you want a package that is incredibly polished. And I feel that in this particular regard, the Jaecoo J7 doesn't quite match up. So now that we're on a much quieter, much better surfaced part of the road, and I can turn on my active cruise control, so it begs the question, would I recommend a Jaecoo J7 over a Mazda CX-5 or a Peugeot 3008 or a Volkswagen Tiguan Allspace? Now, the answer is a little bit complicated. Now, if you need a C-segment SUV to do some proper off-roading kind of things, for example, let's say you own a farm, or perhaps you travel a lot of long distance and you want the security of having all-wheel drive, then the Jaecoo J7 is a relatively affordable way to get into a well-appointed, well-built C-segment SUV that offers all-wheel drive. However, if you're within the market looking for a premium/upmarket but not quite luxury C-segment SUV, and so you want something that has good build quality and impressive refinement, etc., then I do think that the Jaecoo J7 doesn't quite cut it. Now, make no mistake, the J7 is an excellent value proposition, but I have a feeling that customers within this segment are looking for a little bit more than value. Because when you purchase a Mazda, for example, you get things like your 5 years free servicing and your unlimited mileage warranty, as well as the build quality and refinement that you've come to expect from Mazda, and so they very rarely disappoint. The CX-5 is an incredibly impressive vehicle indeed. And then when you get into a Peugeot 3008, for example, these are cars that are designed and built with a certain degree of verve that only the French really manage, and so it does evoke a slightly a feeling of specialness from behind the wheel, which is a little bit hard to put into words. The French have a phrase for it called je ne sais quoi, something that you can't quite emote or explain. And so the J7 is, I feel, a practical right brain choice in a very left brain sort of thing. I hope I got that right. Because logically, this is perhaps the best value premium mass market vehicle out there, but the heart will want different things. And so it does tally up to what you want ultimately. Now, if you want a C-segment SUV that drives particularly well, then you will be more impressed by vehicles like the Mazda CX-5 or the slightly smaller CX-30, both of which have been recently updated with a much more impressive and comprehensive suite of active safety features, more importantly, and which make them much more compelling purchases. And then on the other hand, if you want something a bit more special looking and feeling, then you may be swayed by the Peugeot 3008. And of course, if you want outright power, then you can't really go wrong with the Tiguan Allspace R-Line, which is significantly more expensive than this and offers 2 more seats. So what about the J7? I think that this is going to be primarily purchased by people who either want the all-wheel drive system or people who are really taken by the design. Admittedly, driving around in this particular green example, I have been quite taken with the way it looks. I feel like walking up to it and walking away from it is always a very pleasant experience because I love the color, I do like the way it's styled, and I think that it does make sense as an overall package. It's just that if I were in the market for a vehicle like this, I think my priorities would lead me elsewhere. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think that the Jaecoo J7 is the best package SUV among the lot? I'd certainly like to hear from you. But in any case, that concludes our full review of the Jaecoo J7. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.